Mid-1980s, Brooklyn, New York, a social club on a quiet side street. Louis Big Lou Vallario walked into the club in the morning, conducting business that had become routine over decades. He was a made man in the Gambino Crime Family, the most powerful mafia organization in New York. Vallario was a collector and enforcer, a manager of criminal operations that generated substantial revenue annually. He wasn't John Gotti. He wasn't Sammy the Bull Gravano. He was never going to be the boss, and he probably didn't want to be. But Vallario was essential, a made man who ran crews, managed rackets, and kept the money flowing. He was the kind of mobster who made the mafia work. Disciplined, loyal, deeply embedded in the criminal infrastructure that controlled labor unions, construction sites, gambling operations, and loan sharking networks across Brooklyn. This wasn't glamorous. It was work. Dangerous, illegal, occasionally violent work that required constant attention, careful management, and absolute discretion. Vallario's operations involved meetings with debtors who couldn't pay, union officials who needed favors, and associates who reported on collections, bets, and enforcement actions. He'd been doing this for decades. He'd known John Gotti since childhood. He'd risen through the ranks alongside Gravano, becoming one of the most trusted figures in the Gambino family's Brooklyn operations. He would later serve on the family's ruling panel in the early 1990s, after the boss and underboss were imprisoned, making decisions that affected hundreds of associates and soldiers. But in 2004, after decades of avoiding serious prison time, Vallario would plead guilty to charges including murder conspiracy, extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. He'd be sentenced to 13 years in federal prison, finally paying the price for a lifetime in organized crime. This is the story of Louis Vallario, not the boss, not the celebrity gangster, but the working mobster who represented the real backbone of the American Mafia. This is what life in his world actually looked like. Act 1. The Making of a Mobster, June 16, 1942. Brooklyn, New York. Louis Vallario was born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrant parents from the Piedmont region of northern Italy. The family settled in a working-class neighborhood where Italian, Irish, and Jewish families lived in close proximity, and where organized crime was part of the social fabric. Brooklyn in the 1940s and 1950s was mafia territory. The Gambino, Colombo, Lucchesi, Genovese, and Bonanno families all operated extensively in the borough, controlling docks, unions, construction, gambling, and loan sharking. Kids growing up in neighborhoods like Bensonhurst, Red Hook, and East New York saw mobsters regularly. Well-dressed men who commanded respect, drove nice cars, and never seemed to work traditional jobs. Vallario was one of those kids. He knew John Gotti from childhood. Both grew up in similar neighborhoods. Both were exposed to the same criminal culture. Both gravitated toward the life early. 1960s. Entry into crime. By his late teens and early 20s, Vallario was involved in street-level criminal activity. Bookmaking, loan sharking, small-time gambling operations. These weren't dramatic crimes. They were business operations that required organization, record-keeping, and enforcement. Loan sharking, for instance, involved lending money at interest rates far above legal limits, often 2 to 5% per week, which translated to annual rates of 100 to 250% or more. Borrowers were typically desperate. Gamblers who'd lost big, small business owners who couldn't get bank loans. People in financial crisis. They borrowed $1,000 and owed $1,020 the next week, $1,040 the week after, and so on. If they couldn't pay, the interest compounded. If they still couldn't pay, enforcement began. Threats, beatings, destruction of property. Vallario learned this business thoroughly. He understood how to evaluate risk, how to collect without attracting law enforcement attention, and how to use violence strategically rather than excessively. He also learned the importance of relationships. In the Mafia, your success depended on who vouched for you, who you worked with, and who trusted you. Vallario aligned himself with powerful figures early, particularly Salvatore Aurello, a Gambino family capo who controlled operations in Bensonhurst and Red Hook. 1970s, the Aurello crew. Vallario became a member of Aurello's crew, working alongside other young mobsters, including Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano. The crew ran standard Gambino operations, loan sharking, illegal gambling, bookmaking, extortion, and occasional hijacking of trucks carrying valuable cargo. Gravano and Vallario developed a close working relationship. Both were earners, mobsters who generated consistent revenue for the family. Both were reliable, disciplined, and willing to use violence when necessary. And both understood that advancement in the Mafia required patience, loyalty, and the ability to manage complex criminal operations without drawing excessive attention from law enforcement. By the late 1970s, Vallario was a trusted associate, on track to become a made man, a full member of the Gambino family with the status, protection, and earning opportunities that came with formal membership. Early to mid-1980s, becoming a made man. Vallario was formally inducted into the Gambino family in the early to mid-1980s. The ceremony, conducted according to Mafia tradition, involved an oath of loyalty, a ritual with blood and fire symbolizing commitment unto death, and the understanding that betrayal meant execution. Made membership brought privileges. Vallario could now participate in family decisions, attend important meetings, and command his own crew of associates. He reported to Gravano, who by this point was a capo, a captain controlling multiple crews and answerable directly to the family's leadership. But made membership also brought obligations. Vallario had to contribute a percentage of his earnings to his capo and to the family's administration. He had to be available when called. He had to enforce family rules, participate in violence when ordered, and maintain absolute silence about Mafia activities. And by 1985, everything was about to change. Act 2, the Gotti Era, December 16, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse, Manhattan. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in a brazen hit, ordered by John Gotti. Gotti, who'd been a capo in the family, seized control that night, becoming the new boss with the support of Gravano and other powerful captains. For Vallario, Gotti's takeover was significant. He'd known Gotti since childhood. He was close to Gravano, who became Gotti's underboss, and he was positioned to benefit from the new administration's priorities. Gotti ran the Gambino family differently than Castellano. He was more visible, more aggressive, and more focused on traditional rackets like gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, surrounded by loyalists projecting power and confidence. Vallario wasn't part of the inner circle that surrounded Gotti daily, but he was a trusted operator, someone who ran Brooklyn operations efficiently, generated consistent revenue, and handled problems without needing constant supervision. Vallario's work in the late 1980s and early 1990s involved managing multiple criminal operations simultaneously. While specific daily routines aren't fully documented, his activities can be reconstructed based on the types of rackets he was known to operate. Loan sharking. Vallario oversaw loans to borrowers across Brooklyn. Associates collected weekly payments, tracked balances, and reported problems. If a borrower missed payments, Vallario decided the response: additional interest, threats, or violence. The goal was to extract maximum profit while avoiding situations that might attract law enforcement attention. Illegal gambling. Vallario ran bookmaking operations that took bets on sports, horse racing, and other events. The business required phone lines, often rotated frequently to avoid wiretaps, runners to collect bets and deliver payouts, and enforcers to ensure losing bettors paid. Successful bookmakers balanced the action on both sides of bets, ensuring they profited regardless of outcomes through the VIG, a commission charged on losing bets, extortion, and protection. Vallario collected regular payments from businesses, construction companies, bars, restaurants, union locals. The payments ensured protection from labor problems, vandalism, or competition. In reality, the Gambino family was both the threat and the solution. Union racketeering. This was among Vallario's most significant operations. He had influence in construction and labor unions, particularly locals connected to building trades. This influence allowed him to control no-show jobs, positions where workers were paid but never actually worked, with paychecks going to mobsters or their associates. He also manipulated union contracts, steering work to mob-connected contractors, and extorting companies that wanted labor peace. Late 1980s to early 1990s. Rising influence. As the Gambino family operated under Gotti's leadership, Vallario's role expanded. When Gravano was promoted to consigliere in the late 1980s, Vallario took over Gravano's crew, becoming a capo himself. He now managed multiple soldiers and associates, coordinated operations across Brooklyn, and reported directly to the family's administration. This position demonstrated Vallario's status within the organization. He wasn't the flashiest mobster or the most feared, but he was respected, trusted, and effective. He represented stability in a family that was increasingly under siege from federal prosecutors. Act 3. The Violence, 1989, the Waldweiss murder. Organized crime wasn't just business, it was violence, calculated, strategic, and sometimes personal. And in 1989, Louis Vallario was implicated in a murder conspiracy that would eventually contribute to his downfall. Waldweiss was a recycling executive and former editor who had become entangled with organized crime figures through business dealings. By 1989, there were concerns, whether justified or paranoid, that Weiss might cooperate with federal authorities, providing information that could damage the Gambino family. John Gotti, according to later testimony and court documents, ordered Weiss killed. The hit was carried out by Gambino associates, and Vallario was implicated in the conspiracy through his involvement in Gambino operations connected to the murder. Weiss was killed, and his murder remained unsolved for years. But federal investigators eventually connected the killing to the Gambino family, and when charges were filed in 2004, Vallario pleaded guilty to participating in the murder conspiracy. The murder illustrated a fundamental reality of Vallario's position in the family. Violence was part of the organizational structure. Made men and capos were connected to violent enforcement of family rules, whether through direct participation or through their roles in the criminal enterprise that authorized such actions. The organizational reality. The Mafia operated through a framework where loyalty to the family superseded all other obligations. Betrayal, cooperating with authorities, stealing from the family, disrespecting made men, was considered unforgivable and was punishable by death. Within this framework, violence against perceived threats was viewed as protecting the organization. Made men like Vallario operated within this system, understanding that maintaining position and authority sometimes required participation in or knowledge of violent acts. And by the early 1990s, the Gambino family's violent methods and organizational structure were about to be exposed through one of the most significant defections in Mafia history. Act 4. The Gravano Betrayal. 1991. Sammy the Bull flips. In November 1991, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, John Gotti's underboss, one of the most powerful figures in the Gambino family, agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. He testified against Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence, admitting to participating in 19 murders and providing detailed testimony about the family's operations. Gravano's cooperation was catastrophic for the Gambino family. Dozens of members and associates were indicted based on his testimony. Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 1992. The family's leadership was decimated, but reportedly Gravano refused to testify against Louis Vallario. Despite cooperating extensively, naming names, describing crimes, providing evidence that sent dozens of men to prison, Gravano reportedly protected Vallario. He wouldn't provide testimony that would directly implicate his former crew leader in prosecutable crimes. The reasons aren't fully documented, but it's believed that Gravano felt personal loyalty to Vallario. Vallario had been with Gravano since the Arello crew in the 1970s. They'd risen together, worked together, and maintained a relationship through decades of criminal activity. When Gravano became consigliere, he made Vallario his crew leader. Whether this protection stemmed from genuine loyalty, from Gravano's selective adherence to certain personal codes despite his broader cooperation, or from other considerations remains a matter of interpretation. What's documented is that Vallario avoided prosecution in the immediate aftermath of Gravano's cooperation, while many of his contemporaries went to prison in the early 1990s. The ruling panel. After Gotti and Gravano were imprisoned in the early 1990s, the Gambino family faced a leadership crisis. With the official boss and underboss both incarcerated, the family established a ruling panel, an interim leadership committee to make decisions and manage operations. Vallario was appointed to this panel, serving alongside other senior capos. Together, they managed family operations, resolved disputes, and attempted to maintain organizational structure during a period of intense federal pressure and internal instability. This position demonstrated Vallario's senior status within the organization. He was trusted to help lead the family during one of its most vulnerable periods, making strategic decisions that affected operations across New York. The ruling panel represented an attempt to maintain continuity, but it was ultimately a temporary measure in a family that was fragmenting under prosecutorial pressure. Act 5. The Legal Reckoning, 2001. Union Corruption Indictment. Vallario's avoidance of prosecution didn't last indefinitely. In 2001, he was indicted on charges related to corruption within CRU Local 32BJ, a large union representing building service workers in New York. The charges allege that Vallario and other Gambino associates had used their influence within the union to benefit the family and its associates, engaging in corruption that undermined the union's legitimate functions. Vallario pleaded guilty to the charges. He avoided trial, accepted responsibility, and received a sentence. Though the specific details of that sentence are less extensively documented than his later, more serious conviction. 2004. The major indictment. In 2004, federal prosecutors brought a comprehensive RICO indictment against Louis Vallario, charging him with racketeering conspiracy, murder conspiracy, the Waldweiss killing, extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. The indictment detailed decades of criminal activity, drawing on wiretaps, surveillance, financial records, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. It described Vallario's role in the Gambino family, his position on the ruling panel after Gotti's imprisonment, his management of multiple criminal operations, and his implication in violent enforcement. Vallario faced a potential life sentence. The murder conspiracy charge alone carried enormous weight, and combined with the racketeering charges, he risked dying in prison. In December 2004, Vallario pleaded guilty to the charges. He admitted his role in the Waldweiss murder conspiracy. He acknowledged running loan sharking and gambling operations. He accepted responsibility for extortion and labor racketeering. In exchange for the guilty plea, Vallario received a 13-year federal prison sentence. It was substantial, but far less than the life sentence he could have received if convicted at trial. At 62 years old, Louis Vallario was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. He'd spent his entire adult life in organized crime, over 40 years as an active member of the Gambino family. He'd earned substantial income, wielded power, and commanded respect. Now he faced over a decade behind bars, likely to be released in his mid-70s. With his criminal career definitively over, the sentencing represented the end of an era, not just for Vallario personally, but for the type of mobster he represented. The working capo, the reliable earner, the disciplined operator who avoided the spotlight but kept the money flowing. Federal RICO prosecutions, cooperating witnesses, and sophisticated surveillance had made that role increasingly untenable. Key 6. Understanding the life. What was Vallario's world like? To understand Louis Vallario's story, you have to understand what his life in organized crime likely involved. Not just the dramatic moments of violence or arrest, but the ongoing work of managing criminal operations. While specific daily routines aren't fully documented, Vallario's activities can be reconstructed based on the types of operations he ran and the role he played in the Gambino family. Morning business management. Vallario's work typically involved meetings with associates who reported on collections and operations. Associates would provide updates on loan sharking payments, gambling operations, and extortion collections. Vallario would make decisions about allocating resources, addressing problems, and distributing portions of revenue to the family's administration. He'd also receive intelligence: who was behind on payments, which businesses were causing problems, what law enforcement activity had been observed. This information allowed him to make strategic decisions about enforcement, operational adjustments, and security measures. Ongoing. Union and labor operations. Much of Vallario's criminal activity involved labor racketeering. He maintained influence in labor unions, particularly those connected to construction and building services. This influence generated revenue through various means consistent with typical Gambino operations in this sector. Vallario would interact with union officials and contractors, managing relationships that allowed the family to profit from labor-related corruption while attempting to avoid detection by authorities. Problem-solving and enforcement. Criminal operations constantly generated problems that required resolution. Borrowers couldn't pay. Business owners resisted extortion. Gambling operations faced law enforcement attention. Vallario's role included solving these problems through a combination of negotiation, intimidation, and occasionally violence. The skill required lay in calibrating responses appropriately. Enough pressure to ensure compliance, but not so much that it triggered law enforcement investigations or created unnecessary risks. Strategic meetings. Vallario maintained relationships with other mobsters, capos from other crews, members of the family's administration, associates seeking guidance. These interactions served multiple purposes: coordinating operations, resolving disputes, maintaining alliances, and reinforcing organizational structure. Social clubs and other gathering places served as informal headquarters where business was discussed, relationships maintained, and organizational cohesion reinforced. The constant vigilance throughout all operations was the need for security awareness. Vallario had to assume phones might be tapped, that conversations could be recorded, that associates might be cooperating with authorities, and that law enforcement was conducting surveillance. He avoided creating obvious evidence, spoke carefully, and constantly varied patterns to complicate law enforcement efforts. This vigilance was exhausting and isolating, reflecting the paranoia that was rational and necessary in a world where betrayal could come from any direction, and the stakes were freedom versus decades in prison. Act 7. The loyalty question. Why did Gravano reportedly protect Vallario? One of the most notable aspects of Louis Vallario's story is the reported fact that Sammy Gravano refused to testify against him, despite cooperating extensively with federal authorities. Gravano's cooperation was comprehensive. His testimony resulted in John Gotti's life sentence, led to dozens of convictions, and provided unprecedented insight into Gambino family operations. He admitted to participating in 19 murders, testified against close associates, and violated omerta so thoroughly that he became one of the most infamous informants in mafia history. Yet reportedly, when it came to Vallario, Gravano declined to provide incriminating testimony. The reasons aren't officially documented, but it's believed that personal loyalty played a role. Vallario and Gravano had worked together since the 1970s in the Arello crew. They'd risen through the ranks together, maintained a close working relationship, and Vallario had served as crew leader under Gravano when Gravano became consigliere. Whether Gravano's protection stemmed from genuine respect for Vallario, from adherence to selective personal codes despite his broader cooperation, or from other considerations remains a matter of speculation. What's documented is that this reported protection allowed Vallario to avoid prosecution during the wave of indictments that followed Gravano's cooperation, though he would eventually face charges based on other evidence years later. Louis Vallario was never famous. He never gave interviews, never cultivated media attention, never became a celebrity gangster like John Gotti. Most people who study organized crime have never heard his name. But Vallario represents the reality of the American Mafia more accurately than the famous bosses. He was a working mobster, someone who earned consistently, managed operations competently, and avoided the spotlight. He wasn't flamboyant or dramatic. He was disciplined, patient, and effective. The Mafia functioned because of men like Vallario. Bosses set strategy and made high-level decisions, but capos like Vallario implemented those decisions, managed daily operations, and generated the revenue that sustained the organization. His story illustrates several truths about organized crime. 1. Crime was work. The Mafia wasn't just violence and excitement. It required organization, management, and constant attention. Success demanded discipline and careful execution of operations designed to generate revenue while minimizing law enforcement attention. 2. Loyalty was complicated. The Mafia demanded absolute loyalty, but that loyalty was constantly tested. Gravano's reported protection of Vallario shows that even within a culture where cooperation with authorities was considered the ultimate betrayal, personal relationships could endure. But Vallario's own guilty plea shows that when faced with severe sentences, even loyal mobsters made pragmatic decisions about their futures. 3. The lifestyle had costs. Vallario spent over 40 years in organized crime. He made substantial money, wielded power, and commanded respect within the Gambino family. But he paid for it with constant paranoia, with isolation from legitimate society, and ultimately with 13 years in prison. He spent a significant portion of his later life incarcerated. His criminal career ended, his reputation as a mobster, his defining legacy. 4. The Mafia declined. Vallario's career spanned the peak and decline of the American Mafia. He entered organized crime when the five families dominated New York, when made membership meant power and wealth, when the government struggled to prosecute effectively. He was sentenced when the Mafia was diminished, decimated by RICO prosecutions, informant testimony, and sophisticated surveillance. The ruling panel he served on represented an attempt to maintain structure in an organization under intense pressure and facing existential threats. By 2004, when Vallario pleaded guilty, the era he represented was largely over. Louis Big Lou. Vallario was released from federal prison in 2017 after serving his 13-year sentence. He returned to Brooklyn in his mid-70s, his criminal career definitively over. He's not famous. His story isn't widely taught or featured in major documentaries. He didn't testify extensively against the Mafia or write a best-selling memoir. He served his time, was released, and returned to life outside organized crime as much as someone with his background can. But his story matters because it reflects reality. It's not the Hollywood version of the Mafia, glamorous, violent, dramatic. It's the actual experience of a working mobster, managing criminal operations, maintaining relationships within a dangerous organization, living with constant security concerns, and ultimately facing the legal consequences that decades of criminal activity inevitably bring. Vallario represents what the Mafia actually was for most of its members. Not constant luxury and power, but work in an illegal industry, where success meant earning consistently and avoiding prison, and where the end point was almost always arrest, cooperation, or death. He knew John Gotti as a child and watched him rise to become one of the most famous mobsters in American history. He worked alongside Sammy Gravano, one of the most prolific Mafia figures who eventually became a government witness. He served on the ruling panel of the Gambino family during a critical period, making decisions that affected one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. And in the end, he pleaded guilty, served his time, and left behind a legacy that few outside law enforcement and organized crime history circles know about. Louis Vallario's life wasn't cinematic in the way popular culture portrays the Mafia. It was decades of criminal operations, careful management, relationship maintenance, and the constant awareness that everything could collapse through law enforcement action or organizational betrayal. That's the real story of the American Mafia. Not just the bosses who made headlines, but the working mobsters like Louis Vallario, who kept operations running until federal prosecutors systematically dismantled the organization. And when they did, Vallario, like so many others, learned that decades of loyalty, effectiveness, and discipline couldn't protect you forever. Eventually, the legal system caught up, and the life you'd built in organized crime came to an end. Louis Vallario's legacy isn't fame or infamy. It's a testament to what life in the Mafia actually involved for most of its members. Not constant drama, but methodical criminal work that eventually, inevitably, led to prison. And a reminder that even the most disciplined, loyal, and effective mobsters eventually face the consequences of the life they chose.